This video is sponsored by Rive. Rive has gotten me excited about motion design in a way that I haven't been in years, and it's because Rive makes interactivity possible in my motion design projects. There's just something fresh about not just setting keyframes, but designing how interactions play out with user input. And in this tutorial, it's my goal to give you a taste of that same excitement and teach you how to make your first interactive Rive project. This is the third tutorial in a series where I focus on getting After Effects users up to speed creating projects in Rive. Make sure you check out the first two videos and download the PDF I put together with some of my best Rive tips and most used keyboard shortcuts. You can find that down in the description. Let me know down in the comments if there are any specific Rive topics you'd like to see me cover. Make sure you're subscribed. Now let's take a look at what we'll be creating in this tutorial. There's a lot to learn when it comes to making things interactive, but Rive makes it pretty easy once you understand what the components are and the parameters that you need to adjust. The version of this project that lives on the BattleAxe website, which there's a link to down in the description, has lots of buttons. It gets kind of complicated, but we're going to just narrow this down to 4 buttons to make it simpler to follow along. But the reality is, once we've rigged up a single button, you can duplicate it and reuse it as many times as you want. And it doesn't really matter if there's 20 buttons or 4, it's all the same system and it's all very easily controlled. But there is a lot of new information in this tutorial with the state machine and learning how to create interactions with the animations. So we're going to do this in stages. We'll start by just designing the button and rigging it up so that we can easily animate it. Then we'll create a few different states and learn about the state machine and how we can actually move back and forth between those different states using conditions that are based on interactions from the user. Then we'll build in offset timing so that we can randomize the animation of each instance of the button, as well as build in icon selectors so that with a single rigged artboard, we can duplicate it and offset it as many times as we need to fill the entire canvas. It's a lot of information to get through, but there are chapter markers below so you can jump around and easily find any point of this tutorial. Make sure you take notes. Now let's get started. I'm gonna start by just making a new file, and I know my artboard needs to be 900 by 900, so that's something you should be aware of. When you create it, you can always adjust it later, but it's good to start with the correct dimensions. I'm gonna go ahead and do some organization. I'll call this artboard K-bar buttons, and I'll do the same thing for the name of the file. So K-bar buttons, and we're ready to go. I don't want the background to be gray. I have the hex code that I actually want copied. I'm just gonna paste that in. It's a bright red. And this is just our render canvas, but this is not where I'm gonna design our buttons. I need to make a new artboard for that. So I'm going to press A on the keyboard to bring up the artboard tool, click and drag while holding shift to make it a perfect square. And then I'm gonna come over to my controls and just make it 200 by 200. And I'll zero out the Y position so it's nice and aligned with the first artboard. I'll rename this one button, and for this one I don't actually need a fill in the background, so I'm gonna right click and delete that. That way it's transparent. Let's zoom in a little bit, and let's draw a rectangle in the center to be the face of our button. So I'll press R to bring up the rectangle tool, click and drag while holding shift, and I'm going to make this 100 by 100 pixels. And let's center that up in our artboard and change the colors. I want the fill to be that same red color, so I'll paste that hex code. And then I want to add a stroke, so I'll add a stroke right here and paste in this hex code, which is like a bluish purple color, and make it 5 pixels wide. And let's go ahead and round off both the caps and the joins for that stroke. So now we have a nice rounded stroke on those corners there. All right, so I want to make this the face of my button, but I want it to have some 3D perspective to it. Even though it's faux 3D, it's just a 2D element. And at this state of Rive, there are no skew tools for manipulating the paths that way, but I can directly edit the paths. And since this is a square, it's gonna be very easy to do. So with it selected, I'm gonna press Enter once to go into the path, Enter one more time to manipulate the paths, and select these 2 vertices, and just click and drag them up while holding shift a little bit. I don't need to go very far. I just want to give it a little bit of a shift on that vertical axis, and then press Enter to exit out of that edit mode. So this will be the face of my button, so I'll rename it Face, and I'm just gonna click and drag it up and to the left a little bit. Now to create the extrusion, I'm going to base it on this shape so I have all of the same parallel lines and angles. So I'm going to duplicate this with Controller Command D, and I'll rename this shape Extrusion. and drag the face shape above it. And I'll click and drag this extrusion down into the right. I don't want this to have a red fill. I want to have that same blue color for the fill. So I'm going to copy and paste that over there. And this is the basis of our extrusion. So I'm just going to align this about where I want it to end, which is roughly there. It doesn't have to be 100% precise. I can always modify it later, but I want to add to this path so that it connects to this point and this point right here. So I'm going to, again, press enter once, enter one more time to get into the edit mode, and then click and drag this point up here until it snaps to that vertice. Press P to switch to the pen tool, and then click once to add another point, and click and drag that down to the bottom left corner. So there's my extrusion shape. We've now created this faux 3D look for the button, but now I want to be able to easily animate these 2 points so that they move along attached to this shape right here. And to do that, we're going to use a feature of Rive called Bones. Now this is a rigging tool for character rigs, for distortion, but we're going to be using it in a very simple way just to manipulate these points. Similar to the way that After Effects has the Create Nulls from Paths script, where different null objects can control the individual vertices of a path. This is a technique that I picked up from my friend Joey Judkins. He just recently started making Rive tutorials on his channel. Definitely go check his out, subscribe to him. He's got some great content and you're gonna love his tutorials. But what I wanna do is switch over to my bone tools and select the first one in the list, bone. And this is going to allow me to click and add bones anywhere along this path. In this case, it doesn't really matter where these points live, so I'm just going to put it between these 2 points, which are the 2 that I want it to control, just by clicking once and then dragging out. And I'm gonna hold Shift to just angle this out at a 45 degree and click one more time. And as you can see, I can add in more bones, but I don't want to. I'm just gonna press the escape key and that applies that bone. And then I'll press B to switch back to my bone tool and I'll add another one down here in the bottom right corner. Again, I'll hold Shift and I'll go down in the opposite direction at a 45 degree angle, click one more time and press escape. Again, it doesn't matter how big these bones are or even what orientation they're in because all we're using them for is manipulating the position of these points. Now what I need to do is come over to the Bind Bones section of my Properties panel and click on the plus. This is now going to ask me which bones do you want to bind. I want to use both, so I'm going to click and shift click on both of those and then click Done. Now they're color coded and they show up in this Bind Bones list as well as in the hierarchy, and I want to just label them so I know which one is which. Now this bluish purple one, that's going to be my face bone, and this yellow one is going to be my extrusion bone. Now, if I grab any one of these points, both of those bones are going to show up in this list with a percentage value. This is the weight value of each bone for those points. If you've ever done 3D character rigging and weight painting, this is going to seem very familiar, but if you haven't, basically what it's saying is these points are being influenced as far as the transformations go 100% by the face bone and 0% by the yellow bone, which is what I want for these 2 points. But for these 3 right here, if I select these 3 vertices, I don't want them to be influenced by that bone. I want them to be influenced by the extrusion bone. If I click and drag this up, then it's going to swap the influence of each one of those bones or the weight of those bones. And now I can exit out of this edit mode just by pressing enter. And if I click and drag on this bone, it's going to move those points around. And if I click and drag on this bone, it will move those ones around. That's exactly what I needed, and because these bones show up in the hierarchy, I can now parent them and group them so that they move together. So I'm gonna grab the face bone and the face shape, and I'm going to group them together with Controller Command G and call this face control. And I'll grab the extrusion bone and the extrusion shape, group those, call it extrusion control, and rearrange their orders so that this one is on top. And I don't even need to see those bones anymore. I'm just gonna turn them off. They're just serving as parents basically for those vertice points. But now I can grab this group and move it around, grab this group and move it around, and those 2 shapes are always going to interact the way that we want them to. And now that that's set up, we can move on to the animation. So let's just reposition these so that they're nice and centered in the artboard, and then switch over to animate mode and jump over to our first timeline. Remember, the default design state is the same as what we see in the state machine. So in animation mode, if we're on the state machine, changes we make here will be rippled all throughout all of our other timelines until there are keyframes that say otherwise. Let's go to our first timeline, and what I want this animation to be is basically the idle state of the button. When you load this animation on your browser, it's the state that I want to see the button as the animation loads. So I'm going to call that state the idle state. So I'll double click on the timeline title and call it idle. And I essentially just want this to oscillate back and forth between its extended state and its depressed state. So I'm going to set a position keyframe at the start of my timeline on both the X and the Y, and then I'm going to go forward 40 frames. Now I've already made this animation, that's why I know I need to go 40 frames forward, but I'm just gonna click and drag this group down until it perfectly overlaps the extrusion shape, and now it's gonna go back and forth between those 2 points. So I'm gonna switch my playback from one shot to ping pong, and I'm going to set my work area, just enable that and set it to that range. Now when I play this back, it's gonna bounce back and forth between those 2 points. It's very linear though, so I wanna add some interpolation. I'll select those keyframes, I'll come over to my interpolation, click cubic, and just increase the easing a little bit. I don't want it to be super extreme. I want it to just be this nice oscillating bounciness as that idle animation plays out. That looks great. Now I need to create 2 more timelines for the 2 other states of the interaction, which would be hovering the mouse over the button and then clicking the button. So what do those 2 states look like? Well, when I hover over it, I want the button to raise out or extend out just a little bit further. So let's duplicate our idle animation. We'll just right click and say duplicate, and I'll call this hover, and get rid of these keyframes. So I'll select these 2 keyframes and just press delete, and then I'll click and drag this up and to the left, and I'll hold Control to disable snapping. Basically, I just want to raise that up at the same angle, so I'm going to jump back and forth between hover and idle, and I'm looking at the angle of this line right here, and I can tell it needs to move up just a little bit more, so I'm going to raise it up, and that's almost there. Let's reposition that just a little bit. There we go. Now that angle matches, but it comes out just a little bit further. So that is going to be our hover state of the animation. And this one doesn't need to be ping pong. We'll just set it to one shot. It also doesn't need the work area. It's essentially just a static state of the button. There's no animation. It's just a timeline recording this value. Now what I want to do is duplicate that timeline one more time, and this will be our click state, where this face will be completely pressed in. So I'm going to click and drag this down again to snap it to that value. And now we have our 3 states, the idle animation, we have the hover, and the click state. And I think I can pull that hover out just a little bit further. Yeah, that looks better. Now it has more drastic of a change between those 2 different states. But with those 3 states set, we can now move on to the state machine and set up interactions that determine which one of those states is displayed based on how we're interacting with the graphic. So let's jump over to our state machine and take a look at what we have set up so far. We have the entry point. This is basically the start of the Rive player. When it's loaded on the browser or your app or wherever it is, this is what we will first see. And it's sending it straight to our idle timeline. We can see that with this line connecting the 2 nodes and the arrow saying that's where it's going to go. No conditions, it's just going to play our idle animation. If I press the space bar, that's what we're going to see. But with this state machine node graph, we can set up transitions based on specific conditions, like mousing over the graphic. And we're going to do that with inputs and listeners. These are very, very powerful tools that allow us to custom design interactions of our graphics. And I could use the graphics that are already here to set up these conditions. So I hover over this face, and that's what will trigger the hover state. But one issue that comes up with that, in my case, is that this animation is moving. So if my mouse pointer is right here, it's hovering here and it's not there. I don't want that inconsistency as the idle animation is moving around. I just want to have this area where the face is fully extended be the area that interacts with the hover and the click states. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the face shape and drag it out of the face control object. And I'll rename this to be something that makes sense. So I'm going to call it the hitbox for where the button is actually clicked. Now that's not going to move with the rest of the animation. Obviously I don't want to be able to see it. I just want to be able to interact with it and have Rive identify that is the click area for this interaction. So I'm going to just delete the stroke and I'm going to turn the fill opacity down to 0. Now it's not visible anymore, but it is there. All right, now let's set up some inputs and some listeners. First of all, what are inputs? Well, these are kind of like expression controllers in After Effects. We can add one of three different types: a number, which is just like a slider value, a Boolean, which is a true or false, checkbox on or off, and then a trigger, which is just a signal basically saying this happened. We're going to be using the number and the Boolean for this project. And in this case, we want a Boolean, a true or false checkbox on or off. So I added that input and I'm going to double click it and rename it hover. So this is going to be true when the mouse hovers over the click box and false when the mouse is not hovered over the click box. At least that's how we're going to set it up. Right now, it has no value. It's just true or false, and there's no conditions for it being true or false. What we need is a listener, which will allow Rive to know what it should be paying attention to. So I'm going to click on the plus, that'll create a listener, and over here we're going to see a target field. So if I click on this target, it will then ask, what do you want to be a target? Select the target. I'm going to go over to my hierarchy. I could click in here, but I want to make sure that I click the hitbox and not the face control. And now if I click on that listener again, our hitbox is set as the target. This actually can be done automatically. Let me delete that and just show you that with the hitbox selected, if I click the plus, it's going to automatically set that as the target. So it's just a quicker way to do that. Now let's take a look at what we have over here on our listener controls. First of all, we have a drop-down menu with pointer enter, exit, down, up, and move. So these are things that Rive can listen for. Pointer enter is when your mouse enters that shape, that object, or hitbox. Exit is when the mouse leaves that area. Pointer down would be when we click, pointer up is when we let go of the click, and pointer move is tracking the movement of the mouse, so you can actually track interactions as well. We want this one to be the pointer enter, so basically hovering over that hitbox. So when the pointer enters the hitbox, what do we want to happen? This is kind of like an if-else expression in After Effects. We're going to set an input, which we only have one right now. We've set up the hover state. We're going to set the hover input to true. We could change that to false or toggle, but we want it to be true in this case. When we mouse over this hitbox, that input should be true. Hover should be true. Now that we've set that up, let's press the space bar and hover our mouse over. And you can see the hover checkbox is now checked. It stays checked though, even when we move our mouse away, but it is working. When we hover, it's true. Let's press spacebar to stop that again, and let's set up the next listener, which would be for pointer exit, when the mouse leaves the hitbox. So let's rename this one pointer enter, and then duplicate it and call it pointer exit, and modify the properties. So we want this to be pointer exit instead of enter, and we want to set hover to false instead of true. So now if we play this back, we move our mouse over, it's true. We move our mouse away, and it's false. So we've got that interaction happening, but it's not actually doing anything. It's just an interaction set up to trigger this input on and off. However, this is where we can really take advantage of the state machine and use these triggers that we've set up to manipulate what we're actually seeing in the Rive player. So currently our entry is going straight to the idle animation, but we want to be able to transition from that idle animation into our hover animation. So let's grab the hover timeline and drag it out onto our state machine, and then connect the idle animation to the hover animation. Now if I play this back, it's going to immediately go to that hover state because we haven't set up any kind of conditions stopping this idle animation moving straight into the hover state. So it's moving straight to that state and we're not seeing our animation anymore. Let's fix that. So with my transition between idle and hover selected, we're gonna come over to our properties, and I want to change some of these settings. First of all, the conditions. There are no conditions added yet. We want this to transition only when hover is true. So let's add a new condition, select the input that we want to use as the condition, and say that when hover is true, that's when this transition can happen. So I'll play the animation. It's going straight to the idle and it's ping-ponging back and forth. And as soon as I hover over, we transition to the hover state. And if I move my mouse off, it stays there because we have some more work to do. But before we get there, let's take a look at what other options we have over here. First of all, we have the duration of this transition. It's set to 0 milliseconds, meaning it's instantly jumping to that state. There's no transition whatsoever. But if I change that duration to something like 300 milliseconds and play this back, now it's going to transition to that state when that input of hover is true. It's not going to be instant, it's going to just transition to it over 300 milliseconds. Now it's doing it very linearly because of our interpolation down here, but I could add in a cubic curve to our value graph here and then play it back again. And now it's gonna be easing into that state much more strongly. So that's really cool. But we also wanna be able to get from the hover state back to our idle state. So let's click and drag off of hover and connect it to idle. So we have a two-way street now. We have two transitions and we need to adjust the conditions of this so that it knows when it should go back to idle. So let's go back to our conditions. We want to add a condition and say that when hover is set to false, that's when we transition from hover back to idle. Let's change the duration of this to 300 milliseconds as well and add in some easing with our value graph again and play that back. Now when we hover over, it's going to transition to the hover state, and when we move our mouse away, it's going to transition back to the idle state. So that's really great, but we can push this even a little bit further because right now it's going to move into that transition state fully before going back to the idle animation. Even if I move my mouse really quickly, it's always going to come out to the fully extended hover state before returning to the idle state. And all I have to do to change that is select the transition, come into the settings right here for the playback, and make sure that allow exit during transition is checked. And I'm gonna do that for both of these. Now, if I move my mouse around really quickly, you see that it doesn't have to get to that fully extended state in order to transition back. And that's where this Rive State Machine is just so powerful, because it's able to interpolate between these different timelines at any point within the animation. And we get to design what that translation and interpolation looks like down here. And that's what I love about this system. Now, this is taking longer than I want it to. I don't want the hover to actually take 300 milliseconds. I have all my values recorded, so I'm gonna just change this down to 70 milliseconds. And I also want the interpolation to happen very quickly. I want it to very quickly jump out of wherever it is in that idle animation and ease strongly into that hover state in a duration of only 70 milliseconds. So I'm gonna play this back again, and now it's going to jump very quickly to that state before releasing when I move my mouse away. So that looks pretty good. For this transition out, 300 milliseconds is fine. I'm just gonna increase the easing a little bit on there, and I think that looks pretty good. So now we've got our interaction working between the hover and non-hovering states of our motion. But what about when we click? Well, let's set up that interaction. I'm gonna move this hover state over here, and I'm going to grab my click state and drag it out onto my state machine and connect the hover to the click. Now, we need to set up some conditions here, and we need to create some more inputs. So let's add a new input, and we're gonna use another Boolean and call this click. So when click is true, that should be checked, and when click is false, that will be unchecked. We also need to add another listener. So let's make sure that we have the hitbox selected, click the plus icon, and we'll rename this pointer down. And over here in our options, I want to make sure that I change pointer enter to pointer down. Remember, that's the clicked state of the pointer. And we want to set the click input to true when that's the case, when the pointer is down. I also need a listener for when the pointer is up, when we've released the click. So I'll duplicate this and call it pointer up. I'll come to my options and change this to pointer up and make sure to set the click to false when that's the case. Now that we have those as listeners, we can go to our transition and add in those as conditions. So let's add a condition. When the click is true, then we can transition over to the click timeline. And I want to go back in the other direction. I want to pull click over to hover, and that condition should be when click is false, we'll jump back to the hover state. But I only want that to be true if the mouse is still over that click area. If the user clicked and then dragged their mouse away, then when they let go, the hover state isn't going to be active anymore. So I'd rather have it go back to the idle at that point. So to make sure that that works, I want to also add a second condition on this transition. Let's add another one, and we'll say if hover is also true, then we'll go back to our hover state. So click is false and hover is true, our mouse hasn't moved, then we'll go back to hover. Otherwise, I want to take the click state and go back to the idle animation. So this would be if the click state is false and the hover state is also false. Then we're gonna jump back to the idle animation. And we've got this kind of cycle set up now where it can transition in any direction and end up where it needs to based on the correct conditions. But now we need to change some of those transition values. So going from hover to click, I want that to be very fast. So let's go to our timing. and change this to 50 milliseconds. I want it to be very responsive and snappy. I want to make sure allow exit during transition is checked, and I want to increase the interpolation to be very strongly eased into that motion. For the transition back to the hover state, I'm going to make that 250 milliseconds. Again, allow exit during transition. And the interpolation can be a little bit more eased. It doesn't need to be as drastic. And we'll do a similar thing for this transition. We'll have just a nice easing curve on that value graph, and we're going to make the duration of this 250 milliseconds as well, and have allow exit during transition enabled. Now that we've set up all of those values, this should interact the way that we expect. I'm going to move my mouse over, click, and I'm still holding down. You can see that the click checkbox on the inputs is enabled. When I let go, it goes back to the hover state. I can do that very quickly and very responsively because of this allow exit during transition checkbox and because of the duration settings. And if I click and move my mouse out of that box, we are getting an issue there. And that's because click is still true even though hover isn't. So I need to take a look at my conditions on this transition. That would be the case where I want it to go back to the idle animation. So let me look at these conditions. I have it set up for the click to be false and the hover to be false. So really, I think I can just delete the click and just not pay attention to whether or not the mouse is still clicked, and sure enough, that works. So now if I play this again, I'll hover, that switches to my hover timeline, I click, that goes to click. If I let go and I'm still over the hover state, it transitions back to hover. But if I click and hold down and move my mouse outside of that hitbox, it's going to return back to the idle animation. So that's working exactly the way that I wanted it to. What's so cool about this is that now this interaction is set up, I can come back to my main artboard and I can bring this button in as a nested artboard or a component. This feature is going to be renamed components. It might already be by the time you're watching this video, but I'm just gonna click on that button and I'm going to click once on my artboard, and this would be a list of all of the artboards in my Rive project file. That's the only other one, so I'm gonna click that. And now I have an instance of that button. I can hold Alt or Option to drag this around and realign it so that it's just nice and organized, and I can duplicate both these buttons again, move them down, and now I have this grid of 4 buttons, which if I press the space bar, it's going to play the state machine for each one of those instances, and I can interact with each one of them individually, click on them, and just have a lot of fun offsetting their motions based on my interactions. And with all of that done, we're well on our way to completing this interactive animation. What I want to do next is bring in the icons that I'm going to put on each button and rig it up so that I can select which icon is visible depending on which instance of the button I'm using. And to do that, we need to head back to the state machine in the button artboard. So let's jump over here, and we're going to set up a second animation layer of our state machine, which is something we took a look at the last tutorial where we combined a few different animations into one. In this case, we're going to use one layer for the interactions, and I'll go ahead and just rename this interactions. And then we're going to use a second layer for the different icons. So I'm going to rename this icon selection. And before we go any further, we obviously need to have our icons in this project. So I have them here in Illustrator. The quickest way to get graphics from Illustrator to Rive is simply just copying them and then pasting them right inside of Rive. It will upload them as SVGs. You can find them in your assets panel and drag them straight in. It's going to be nice and organized. I'm just going to scale all of these down by pressing E on the keyboard to switch to the scale tool. Click and drag while holding the Shift key to do it proportionally, and then just move these around so that they're aligned on this button right here. So Anubis looks like it's the biggest one. I think I'm gonna base it off of that one, maybe right about there. So let's just say 55% on the X and Y. I'll just remember that when I bring in new icons, that's the scale I need to bring them down to. Now I'm going to ungroup these so we have Rubber Hose, Overlord, Anubis, and Time Lord, and I want to align all of these to the center of this button. So I'm just gonna drag it around and use my guides to make sure it goes right there in the center. But there is an issue here, and that is that these are not skewed like the button is, and that looks a little bit off. Unfortunately, at this stage of Rive, there are no skew tools, there's no skew transformations like we have in After Effects, so I'm gonna need to do this inside of Illustrator before I bring the icons in. So I'm actually just going to delete those 4 icons, and the way that I did this originally was just by taking a screenshot of this graphic, so I have the skew dimensions or the skew angles already there, and I pasted pasted it into Illustrator and moved it to the back and just scaled this down a bit. So I'm gonna use the Overlord icon as my reference, select all of them, make sure I don't have that image selected, and then I'm going to use the shear tool, which is underneath the scale tool here, set my shear point right here on that point, click and drag while holding Shift to shear it upwards, and just about there, that looks pretty good. That's all it took. Now that that's built in, I can copy and paste those into Rive one more time, drag that out, which I don't need this one anymore, and then scale that down to 55% on the X and Y, and that should line up very nicely now and match the distortion that I have here in Rive. Okay, let's ungroup these one more time with Control-Shift-G. I'm going to align all these to the center on the horizontal and vertical axes, and then drag this over so it's aligned to that button face. The color is not correct. I don't want them to be gray, so I'm just gonna select this with the eyedropper and choose the blue color. Now those are all there, but obviously I don't wanna see them all at the exact same time. So what I need to do is use a feature of Rive called a solo group. That's underneath the artboard menu. L is the keyboard shortcut, and I'm just gonna click right around the center of that group. I'm gonna make sure that aligns to the center of the face as well. But solos are basically groups, but they only allow one object within their hierarchy to be visible at a time, which is exactly what we need. So I'm going to grab those 4 shapes and drag them into the solo group, and I'll call this icon solo. And if I open up that solo, you can see a solo switch that allows me to go between each individual icon. This is perfect for what we need. I want this to be parented to the face control group, so I'm going to move it into that hierarchy. And now if I play this back, my icons are going to move and interact with all of the other motion in my graphic. Now I need to create timelines for each one of these solos. So basically each solo state, so I have 4 unique timelines to pick from in my state machine. So let's go over to our timelines, and I'm going to make a new timeline with just default settings, and I'll double click on it and call this one Rubber Hose. I'll then click on my icon solo and make sure that I set a keyframe for that active switch. So there's a keyframe saying this is the Rubber Hose timeline. Then I'll duplicate this and I'll call it Overlord, and I'll switch this over to Overlord. Now we have 2 different timelines showing 2 different icons. I'll do that 2 more times, once for Anubis, and then 1 more time for Time Lord. Now this is getting a little bit more complicated and more messy in my animations panel, and with the final graphic I had 20 different icons, so it's important to stay organized wherever you can. And fortunately, we can create folders for timelines. So I'm gonna call this icons and drag all 4 of those into that folder. And I'm gonna make another folder here, drag it out, and I'll call this interactions, and drag these 3 timelines into it, and then move my state machine to the top. All right, so inside of my icons, I have my 4 different solo states. Let's go back to our state machine on our icon selection layer and set this up to display one of those 4 icons. So I'm just gonna grab one of them and drag it out and connect the entry point to it. I don't need to do anything about the transition. I want it to immediately display one of these timelines, but instead of leaving this at its default standard timeline type, we're going to come over here and look at these tabs. We have single timeline, which is what it's set to, but we also have blend 1D, one dimension, or blend additive. Blend 1D is what we're going to use to be able to combine multiple timelines together and select which one is being displayed. So I need an input for this to work. And to do that, we're gonna come over to our inputs and click the plus. And this time we're going to use a number input, which is just like a slider in After Effects. It doesn't do anything on its own, but we can use it to manipulate other parts of our project. I'm gonna rename this icon selector, and then come over to our blend timeline and choose that as the input, our icon selector. Then I want to come down to the timelines and click on the plus. So this is where we can select which timelines are going to be blended together. And the first timeline will be Rubber Hose. Then I'll click the plus and we'll add a second one. This will be Overlord. Then we'll click the plus again. This will be Anubis, and then one more time for Time Lord. And we have a value next to each one of these timelines. They're all set to 0. But if I assign a number index to each one, so we'll say 1 for Rubber Hose, 2 for Overlord, 3 for Anubis, and 4 for Time Lord, they all get color coded now, very similar to the weight painting of the bones. And we have a graph that represents the influence of each one of those timelines being blended together. Now, what we're actually blending between these timelines is essentially a hold keyframe for each one of the states of this solo. You cannot interpolate between these different solo states, so we're not seeing any kind of blended opacities or anything like that between the icons. But because we set the icon selector as our input, if I change the icon selector to say 3 and then play the state machine, Anubis is what's going to be visible. Or if I change it to 2, we're gonna go to Overlord. 1 is Rubber Hose and 4 is Time Lord. So we've set up a value that we can manipulate to modify which icon is visible, and that's exactly what we needed. So let me stop the state machine, I'll set that icon selector back down to 1, and there's one more thing that I need to do that's very important, which if I select the icon selector and then we come over here, expose to parent artboard is a checkbox that I need to enable. As soon as I do that, it's going to allow me to come back to my main artboard, and that value is going to show up inside of the inputs for each instance of that artboard. So let me just rename these really quickly so it's easier to identify. This first one is going to be Rubber Hose. The second one is Overlord. The third one is Anubis. And the last one is Time Lord. Now they're much more easy to identify down here. I can go into Rubber Hose, make sure icon selector is set to 1. Overlord should be set to 2. Time Lord to 3. Or sorry, that should be 4, and Anubis to 3. Now with all of those set, it doesn't actually display those icons until I play the state machine, and now all 4 icons are visible. They're all customizable. And like I said, we can expand this to as many icons as we need. So as we make more products at Battle Axe, I'll be able to update this graphic and just assign a new value to it, adding the timeline to that blend in the state machine, and it'll be fully customizable and very easy to update. All right, so we've got our animation working, the interactions are working, we're very easily able to customize which icon is being displayed on each button, but it all starts at the exact same time. I want each button to have its own unique starting point for this animation loop so that it's randomly playing from the beginning and not just when you interact with it. So we need to, again, jump back to our button and add in some more timelines in a very similar way to what we just set up with our icon selection. But we're gonna do it back on the interactions timeline, and instead of just using a single idle timeline here, we're again going to blend multiple idle animations together. So let's jump back over to our animations and find our interactions folder, and there's our idle animation. Now I'm going to duplicate this, and idle 2 is fine. I'm gonna call the first one idle 1, but in idle 2, I wanna change some things about this timeline. First of all, I wanna change the playback to loop instead of ping pong, and I wanna make the duration of this longer. So let's say 4 seconds instead of 1, and that'll give me plenty of room to loop this manually. So I'm gonna select the first keyframe and copy. This is 40 frames forward. I'm gonna hold Shift and press period 1, 2, 3, 4 times to jump 40 frames forward again and paste. And there's one loop of the animation. Then I'll copy and paste that again, and now I have 2 full loops. From here, I can grab my out point and set it to be right there at that same mark of that third keyframe, and it's going to play back the exact same animation, just in loop form instead of ping pong now. But now that I have 2 loops, I can offset the work area to change the starting and ending points. So I'm gonna go forward 10 frames from here and move my work area's in point to that frame. And I'll do the same thing for the out point. Go to frame 50 instead of 40, and now it's going to start here in the animation and loop through. I'm gonna do this 2 more times, and maybe you caught this. I accidentally did that on idle 1. I'm gonna rename that idle 2 and this idle 1. And then I'm going to duplicate 2. So let's duplicate that. And I'm just gonna offset this 10 frames forward again. So Shift period to move that forward 10 frames. Make sure that's nice and aligned, and then do it again for the out point. And I'll do this until I have 4 unique timelines that all start at different points. Move this forward 10 frames. And then this one forward 10 frames. And all of the animations will look exactly the same, their timings will just be different. Now what we need to do is jump back to our state machine and grab this idle 2 animation and then change it from a single timeline to a blend 1D timeline. And I need to make another input for it. So let's come back to our inputs and make another one, another number, and we'll call this animation timing, and we'll set this to a value of 1. Then come back to our blend and change that to be our input, animation timing. And then we again need to set up our timeline. So the first one will be idle 1, The second one will be idle 2. Third one is idle 3. And the fourth one is idle 4. And I'll index those again, just like the icon selector. So 1, 2, 3, 4. With the input of the animation timing. Now I again need to select that and make sure Expose to Parent Artboard is selected, but with all of that set up, we should be able to jump back to our main artboard, and then again, find that input for every single instance of that artboard. So for Time Lord, we have animation timing in addition to the icon selector. Let's change animation timing to 2. I'm just gonna do this randomly. We'll say 3 for Anubis. We'll say 4 for Overlord and 1 for Rubber Hose and see what that looks like. Now each one of these buttons has a random starting point with the same animation and the same interactions. So this is exactly what I was after. It's set up to be repeatable and easily adjustable, expandable however far I need it to go, and works exactly the way that I wanted it to. Like I said, you can view this on the BattleAxe website. The link is down in the description if you want to try interacting with this yourself to see just how responsive it is, but I'm very happy with the way that this turned out and how it's going to always start at a randomized offset for each one of these buttons. Let me know what you thought about this tutorial and make sure to tag me at JakeInMotion when you create your first interactive project. I'd love to hear what you want to learn next about Rive, so leave a comment with any tutorial suggestions and come join the JakeInMotion Discord server. There's an invite down in the description. I want to say a huge thank you to Rive for sponsoring this video and for creating an app that's reignited my excitement for motion design. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next video.
Motion.